Hello everybody. This session is on comparing the NEC4 Engineering Construction Contract with the NEC Engineering Construction Contract Hong Kong edition and highlighting the key differences between these two contracts. We're going to cover an overview of the Hong Kong edition, and then I'm going to look at different sections of the contract, working fairly logically through the contract, through the core clauses, dispute clauses and secondary option clauses, to cover off the key differences between the two contracts. Why have we produced a Hong Kong edition? The key reason is to produce an NEC ECC contract that is more closely aligned with specific legislation and policies that are used in Hong Kong within the public sector. We've taken full advantage of the features of NEC contracts in terms of the flexibility, in terms of how the scope can be used. One of the key parts of developing Hong Kong edition was to look at the Development Bureau's existing additional conditions of contract and standard amendment schedule, and seeing where this can be rationalised and incorporated into the main body of the contract. And what we've ended up with is a contract bespoke to Hong Kong with a rationalised schedule of amendments that Development Bureau hold. As a reminder, all NEC contracts, including the Hong Kong edition, have a number of key characteristics, and the Hong Kong edition is no different. And they include providing a stimulus to good project management, providing flexibility in terms of how the contract can be used in a variety of different situations, along with providing flexibility in terms of the allocation of risk between the parties. And this contract very much follows the same approach as all other NEC contracts do. In terms of the overall structure of the contract, the Hong Kong edition, it's exactly the same as the NEC4 ECC. So we still have the same parts to the contract as shown in this diagram. So we have contract data, parts 1 and 2, and they will identify the other parts of your contract, so the conditions of contract, the pricing document, which will depend upon the main option clause chosen, the scope information and the site information. The function of the different parts of the contract remain the same as the NEC4 ECC. So the purpose of contract data is to recall project-specific information and to identify the other parts of our contract. The scope document specifies and describes the works and states any constraints on how the contractor is to provide the works. So this would include technical specifications and drawings, logistical constraints and other similar information. The site information describes the past and present conditions of the site and its surroundings. So examples of the information that may be included here be existing services information, existing as-built information or geotechnical information that is appropriate to the works that are being undertaken. And the pricing document, which will depend upon the main option clause chosen, would be either an activity schedule if we're using option A or C, or a bill of quantities if we're using options B or D, and they record the prices and how the prices are adjusted during the contract. Alongside the Hong Kong edition, there are a number of user guides that are specific to the Hong Kong edition. So Volume 2, Preparing an Engineering Construction Contract, there is a specific Volume 2 for the Hong Kong edition, as there is a Volume 4, which is about managing the contract. And these are available from NEC. Moving into talking about the conditions of contract themselves. Those who are familiar with the NEC4 ECC will see that the structure of the core clauses remains the same. There's still the same 9 sections to the core clauses. In terms of main option clauses, we still have the 6 main option clauses, A through F. There's been a few changes to the dispute and secondary option clauses, and we can see here in terms of dispute clauses we now have a new W4 option, and this is specific to Hong Kong and provides for dispute resolution along the lines of using adjudication, mediation and arbitration, and link in with the security of payment provisions. So the original three W clauses, options W1, 2 and 3, have been removed from this version of the ECC as they are not applicable to Hong Kong. In terms of the secondary options, there's a long list over the next few slides. They largely remain the same as per the NEC4 ECC. You can see they go on. But there is a new secondary option clause that's been introduced within the ECC Hong Kong edition, and that's X30, and I'll talk about that in a little while. The next couple of slides summarise the changes to the clauses within the ECC, and they can be broadly categorised as a number of new clauses that have been added, or existing clauses that have been amended, or clauses that have either been fully replaced or removed as they don't apply or are not appropriate to the Hong Kong edition. As we go through this table, you'll notice that not every clause in the contract has been changed. So for example, section 4 of the contract and section 7 of the contract, there are no amendments to these or changes to these sections. The main changes, as you can see, in terms of removing clauses, are the dispute clauses, W1, 2 and 3, that have all been removed, and the introduction of W4, which deals with dispute resolution following the security payment provisions and general practice in Hong Kong. Overall, there have been around 150 changes to the contract, between new clauses being added, clauses that have been changed, or clauses that have been removed. And we're talking a bit more detail about a number of these changes through the rest of this session. So we're going to move through the clauses in a fairly logical manner, starting with section 1 of the core clauses, and I'll summarise the key changes. We've introduced a number of new defined terms. First three relate to legislation in Hong Kong. We've introduced a new defined term called tier subcontractor, and that's in relation to the practice in Hong Kong of passing down obligations from the contractor onto subcontractors, and the flow down of obligations from the main contract to each tier of subcontracting. A number of the existing defined terms have been changed, and that's mainly to do with the changes with the dispute clause and the introduction of W4. We have a new clause in section 12 that deals with third-party rights, and this of course is specific to legislation in Hong Kong. Provisions around corrupt acts have been amended or changed, and again this is to align with Hong Kong legislation and requirements. So the definition of a corrupt act now aligns with the Prevention of Bribery Ordinance, and there are obligations with regard to notifying the client and the ICAC when a party or when the contractor becomes aware of a corrupt act. There's been a small tweak to clause 19.1 to encourage the contractor to engage with the project manager to discuss ways of dealing with a prevention event and agreeing how the issue may be resolved before the project manager instructs the contractor. Clause 26 of the contract deals with subcontracting, and new defined term of a tiered subcontractor has been brought into this clause, and the reference to use an NEC subcontractor has been removed. That's not to say an NEC subcontract cannot be used, it's just to say that the requirement to share the documentation if an NEC subcontract is used remains. Within the assignment provisions, within clause 28, there's been a small change there requiring the contractor to obtain the client's agreement before transferring the benefit. The disclosure provisions in clause 29 flow down to tier subcontractors, and one of the new clauses deals with the circumstances when the client can disclose information. In terms of section 3 of the contract that deals with time, only a couple of changes. And these are to do with the timescales associated with either certifying completion. So we've introduced some flexibility. The default is the project manager certifies completion within 1 week, or a different period if it's stated in contract data. So this provides some flexibility for the client in terms of how quickly completion needs to be certified. In a similar manner, there is flexibility in terms of how quickly takeover occurs. The default being 3 weeks, but on a specific project, this period can be changed if the entry in contract data is used. Again, this is about providing flexibility. In terms of payment, the change here is the timing of when the application for payment is submitted by the contractor, and is now 2 weeks before the assessment date. And in terms of what we're assessing, and more specifically the price of work done to date, and this applies to the cost-based contracts, it'll be a forecast of what will have been paid 1 week after the next assessment date. So this should help the contractor in terms of cash flow. In terms of the timing of certifying the payment, NEC4 ECC was 1 week, and it's now been changed to within 2 weeks of the assessment date. Payment is subject to the client's right of set-off, and interest is calculated on a simple interest basis. The provisions around final assessment have been changed from standard NEC4 ECC. Standard NEC4 required the project manager to make the final assessment, irrespective of an application for payment from the contractor. The Hong Kong edition requires the contractor to submit an application for payment in relation to the final assessment. The timescales within which the application are submitted are similar to NEC4 ECC. So the application needs to be submitted within either 4 weeks of the defect certificate or 13 weeks of a termination certificate. But there is flexibility for the parties, the contractor and the project manager, to agree a longer period within which the application is made. Once the application is made, the project manager certifies the final payment within 4 weeks, and then the payment is made within 3 weeks of the certification, or a different period if stated in contract data. In terms of compensation events, the overall process hasn't changed. There have been a number of changes to specific events or compensation events. So the weather event has been changed to better reflect weather conditions in Hong Kong. It recognises when a tropical cyclone warning signal number 8 or above are hoisted, or where there's a rainstorm warning. And there is flexibility within the contract to define or add in additional types of weather conditions that may be subject to compensation event. We have a new compensation event, 60.1 brackets 21, that deals with labour shortages. And then within a number of other compensation events, there's been a couple of amendments. Within clause 60.1 brackets 12 and brackets 19, the reference to contract date has been changed to the tender closing date. And within clause B 60.4 and D 60.4, the threshold for when the remeasure of items in the bill may become a compensation event, we've introduced flexibility in the threshold can be increased by stating a percentage in contract data. And obviously if no percentage is stated in contract data, then the default 0.5% would apply. The use of people rates within main options A and B have been removed, and so when assessing compensation events under options A and B, and specifically looking at the people costs, we would be looking to assess the actual cost of people based on the concept of what would be or what would represent an open market competitively tendered cost for that type of person. In terms of section 8 of the contract, there have been a few changes. Reference to strikes have been removed from clause 80.1, and so a strike would by default be a contractor liability. Within 81.1, flexibility has been created by reference to contract data, and in contract data, if appropriate, liabilities that are in addition to those defined within 81.1 can be stated. In terms of recovery of cost, so this is clause 82, we have a new clause that allows the client to recover sums from the contractor where the contractor is liable to the client under other contracts with the same client. The insurance table has been moved. It used to sit within clause 83, and now the table has been moved to contract data. And this is about providing greater flexibility in terms of what insurances are provided, who provides them, and the minimum amount of cover for each applicable insurance. Lastly, in terms of the core clauses, section 9 deals with termination, and there have been a few tweaks. So within clause 91.7, be consistent with other parts of the contract date has been changed to tender closing date, and within clause 91.8, so this is to do with corrupt acts or terminating because of a corrupt act, reference to a tier subcontractor has been included. I'm going to move on now and talk about dispute clauses and the new option W4. This option covers all types of dispute, including payment disputes as defined within the security of payment provisions. And the clauses describe the escalation process for each type of dispute. For any type of dispute, the first step is to refer it to the project manager for a decision, unless the dispute is related to payment and it has already been referred to the adjudicator. Where a dispute has been referred to the PM, they're required to make a decision within 4 weeks and notify the parties accordingly. Where it's a payment dispute that has been referred to the adjudicator, the timescale within which they notify a decision is set out in the security of payment provisions. If a party is dissatisfied with the decision of the project manager or the adjudicator, once the decision of those parties, the project manager or the adjudicator, has been made, the party can then refer the dispute to mediation, and the timescales within which to do that is 4 weeks. You can see if it's not a payment dispute, a longer period may be agreed between the parties for how quickly it's referred to mediation. Depending upon how the mediation moves forward and or whether it is concluded or not, a party may refer the dispute to arbitration. And depending on the circumstances, the timescale within which to do that is within 13 weeks of one of the listed items here occurring. The arbitrator then conducts the arbitration in accordance with the arbitration rules and provides a decision within the timescales set out within the arbitration rules. Moving on to the secondary options, we've made some changes to X1. The key change here is where the table of proportions sits. And it now sits within Contract Data Part 2 rather than Contract Data Part 1, and the intention here is for the contractor to provide the table or schedule. Another key change is where the index figure that has been used to calculate the inflation, if that index figure changes, or is corrected, should I say, in due course, then the payment that was made using the old figure is then subject to being adjusted or corrected to take account of the new figure. X2, change in law. The scope of this clause is flexible and has been changed to only cover enactments or legislation that are specifically listed in contract data. So it doesn't cover all pieces of legislation or enactments. We then set a point in time after which a change in such an enactment or legislation would constitute a compensation event, and this is done by reference to the tender closing date, and then we define when the compensation event is triggered. X7, delay damages. The change here is that a minimum rate for delay damages has been introduced. So this is a figure that would need to be stated in contract data. X14, advance payment. So this has been changed to reflect practice in Hong Kong, where there's a requirement for the contractor to submit an advance payment statement and declaration. The requirement for the contractor to provide an advance payment bond has been removed. X16, retention. The change here is that there is a limit of the amount to be retained. So there's a maximum amount of retention that can be retained, and this is something that needs to be stated in contract data. Similar to X14, the optional requirement to provide a bond has been removed. X30, innovation and technology. So this is a new clause that has been introduced to the Hong Kong edition, and as the title of the clause suggests, this is about encouraging the parties and the contractor to innovate. And you can see in the second bullet, provisions specifically refer to proposing changes that enhance safety, supervision, or support decarbonisation. The provisions are similar to how early warnings are managed, in that either the contractor or the project manager propose changes and the parties meet to discuss the changes and work through the detail, and subject to what they agree in the meeting, or maybe there needs to be more than one meeting, the parties will move ahead with the change. We have a INT register. So this is similar to the early warning register, and the purpose of this document is to record what's discussed in the meetings along with recording the proposal itself, and also to track where we've got to in terms of either making this change or not. And so the intention here is to have regular meetings to consider proposals and decide the next steps. Where a proposal requires the scope to change, the project manager is required to instruct. And of course, a change in scope, depending on its nature, may trigger a compensation event. Now I'm going to move on to cover the changes made to the scheduler cost components and the short scheduler cost components. So within both the scheduler cost components and the short scheduler cost components, pension costs are excluded, including those related to the Mandatory Provident Fund Scheme Ordinance and the Occupational Retirement Schemes Ordinance. As mentioned earlier, within the short scheduler cost components, and so this only applies to options A and B, people rates have been removed. So we're going to rely upon the actual costs of the people when assessing compensation events. So that's the same principle that applies to the cost-based contracts, C, D, E and F. Within the equipment section, so this is section 2 of the short schedule, most of the rates, the tendered rates, have been removed. A bit like people, the principle would then apply that we are going to use the actual costs for equipment when assessing compensation events. But as with people, The actual costs are predicated on being those costs that represent open market or competitively tendered prices. Within the charges section, so this is section 5 of the schedule, there are a number of statutory charges that are excluded, as noted here. And then costs associated with providing accommodation for the project manager and or supervisor have now been included within the charges section. They would have been included under the equipment section previously. Within section 6, manufacturing and fabrication, and section 7, design, as with equipment, the tendered rates have been removed. So again, we are reliant upon determining the actual cost for manufacturing and fabrication or design predicated on what is represented by an open market or competitively tendered cost. We have a new section in the scheduler cost components and the shorter scheduler cost components, and this is section 9. And this covers any insurance premiums that the contractor is paying for any of the insurances that they are responsible for as identified in the insurance table. So insurance premiums under NEC4 ECC were excluded from the schedule and hence excluded from defined cost, but now they are included in defined cost and included in the schedule. Lastly, contract data. As you may have picked up as we've gone through this presentation, there were a number of new identified terms. So identified terms are terms in italics. We have 13 new identified terms, so that requires 13 new entries in contract data. In addition to those new identified terms, there are a number of other new entries that are required in contract data as a consequence of the changes within the Hong Kong edition. That concludes this session. I'd just like to remind everyone that there is support out there from the NEC. They have a range of training courses that are available, from introductory courses to more practical day-to-day courses, and of course advanced courses including the accreditation courses. NEC also provide consultancy services to organisations. There is the NEC Community app. It's free access, no subscription required. And it includes the latest news and updates and NEC announcements.